Good day, everyone. My name is Jamie Richards, and it is my honor and my pleasure to welcome you to our latest session of Ranger Rendezvous 43. I want to thank you all for tuning in today. We have a fabulous presentation ahead. My good friend, Ranger Shelton Johnson, is going to be joining us from a location just outside Yosemite National Park. Shelton has had a lucrative career in the National Park Service, starting at Yellowstone and most recently working his way up to Yosemite National Park, where he spent the majority of his career as a ranger in the National Park Service. So I would like to welcome my friend Shelton Johnson to the screen.
Hey, and hello, everyone. My career has lasted at this point for 33 years, and it was very unlikely that I would have become a national park ranger given where I grew up. I grew up in the inner city of Detroit, Michigan, and there was nothing about Detroit that really was reflective of anything resembling a national park, let alone rooted in the national park idea. And yet, if you had gone back into Detroit's early history, it was a wilderness environment. There were basically deciduous trees, and there were bears. There was wildlife, bald eagles. I mean, the early frontier Detroit as a settlement was the wild. It was the definition of the wild, and that gives a sense of how we have transfigured this continent and made it look completely different than what it once appeared or how it once appeared. So in the course of things, I became a national park ranger in Yellowstone, and those are some of my favorite memories being in that park. My first job was welcoming visitors from all over the world to Yellowstone National Park. And one of the things that always struck me, during that process and that literally being rerouted as opposed to rerouted, because I was originally trained to be a poet and a classical musician. So I was rerouted into this profession of rangering. And I'm wearing the uniform. I'm welcoming visitors all over the world at the busiest entrance station to Yellowstone National Park, which of course is the West Gate. And as I'm doing that, I'm obviously aware that I'm African American, and I don't know if you folks have noticed it at this point, but I am African American, and there were very few African American rangers in Yellowstone in 1987 when my career began. As a matter of fact, I was the only African American park ranger in Yellowstone when I served there back in the late 80s. And there were visitors coming in who had never seen an African American park ranger before, and it was sometimes obvious just in the way they held themselves and when they looked at me when I was right there at the entrance station. And for a while, I felt really separate. I felt that I didn't quite really belong in that environment, even though I loved it from the start. But then I began to notice something that was not so clear at the outset, which is that I wore and wear the same uniform that my compatriots wear. We wear the same hat. We abided by the same philosophy that is the underlying spine of the National Park Service as an agency. And I realized that the gray and green superseded the brown. It superseded the melanin that courses through me. It didn't just supersede it; it just was it being part of it. I am who I am. I will always be that. But the gray and green became part of what I projected to the world, and so I realized that was a very powerful thing. The whole notion of a uniform. And I'm saying this to you because a few weeks ago, I was on a very interesting Zoom broadcast. I was speaking to community rangers. These were indigenous people on the Tibetan Plateau on the far side of the world. And we were having a conversation. And what was interesting about the conversation is what I was saying or what we were saying. I was part of this panel. And what we were all saying in English first had to be translated into Chinese, into Mandarin. And then once it was translated into Mandarin, then it had to be translated into the Tibetan language. And each time that happened, you had to really think carefully about how to parse your words and try to say things as economically short and strong, as possible because of that translation, that layer of translation. But what struck me at the same time that this was happening, this sort of long end of the world sort of translation, was just the idea that we were communicating with these Tibetan rangers who were part of the indigenous people of the Tibetan Plateau. And this area was essentially the largest national park in the world. This park is called Sanjianwang. And Sanjianwang, again, is in the Tibetan Plateau, and the lowest area in this park is 12,000 feet above sea level, and the highest area goes up to over 20,000 feet above sea level. And we couldn't see them, nor could we hear them. We just were speaking to them as I'm speaking to you right now. And the words that we were all saying were being translated into Mandarin, and then into the Tibetan language. And it was a one-way conversation, but it was just that thought as I close my eyes as I'm talking to you, that people on the far side of the world in a different day were literally hearing what we were saying and hearing the translation of that. Sometimes, my background is poetry, and usually in poetry, you hear the phrases that poetry is what's lost in translation. But often truth can be found in translation, and connection can be made, can be forged in translation. And so I wish that I could have been in two places at the same time and been there on the far side of the world, hearing what we were all saying, but hearing it in the language of the Tibetan people, and feeling what that must have felt like to be conversing with someone who you do not know, someone who you will never, perhaps never see again. They will never walk into your home, and you will never say, "Hey, are you thirsty? Are you hungry? I have some food here. I have some nourishment here." Well, that might not ever happen, but at the same time, we felt this sense of connection. We felt this sense that these people that we may never meet were family in some way. And what I realized was that it was that uniform again, that same uniform I was wearing in Yellowstone beginning in 1987, that gray and green. These Tibetan community rangers, they have a yellow vest. So they have their indigenous clothing that they normally wear with their herding their yaks and so forth, but they have these yellow vests that identifies them as these Tibetan rangers who work for China. So I kept thinking about what we wear on the surface of things that actually reflects and mirrors what we hold dear in the heart of things. And that is that passion for the earth, and that passion to celebrate these natural processes, which is a very formal way of saying, Mother Earth herself and who she is, and sharing that identity with the world and with people who have forgotten those connections. So I'm saying that the uniform is important. The uniform is an externalization of an internal process of becoming, and a sense of self. And rangers are, I don't know if rangers are we're born and not bred. I think it's a little bit of both, but I think that that's something that's really important to communicate right now, because with what's going on right now in the world, there's so much divisiveness, there's so much conflict, and we make far too much of differences that are absolutely superficial, have no meaning whatsoever. And meanwhile, there are similarities coursing through our blood and our minds like the light above us. And these similarities bind us all together. But we rarely see that common humanity that we all share, because meanwhile, we're just focusing on things that are just absolutely superficial and indifferent to who we are as human beings and who we are as a species. So I can't say that all of that was going through my mind when I was talking to these rangers, because but it was because there was a lag time when we made when we expressed what we were saying. We had to hear it, sit there and hear it all in Mandarin, and then we had to hear it communicated in Tibetan. So when all that's happening, you're just like this, and you're waiting for what you're going to say next. It's not it's not the best kind of conversation to have in terms of a dialogue, but it really made you think carefully about what you were about to say, because what you were about to say was about to become translated not just into another language, but transferred to another part of the world, a different way of thinking, a different way of feeling, a different way of being in this world, an indigenous perspective, as opposed to this perspective that dominates our national conversations, which all tend to be urban. 100 years ago, around 1900, most Americans classified themselves as living a rural existence. 100 years later, by the year 2000, most of us would say that we're living an experience of being urban. And so I grew up as an urban African American in Detroit, and that's a very different experience than being part of a group, an indigenous group on the Tibetan Plateau. And you're out there in the middle of this vastness. I mean, this park that is Sanjianwang is actually 26 million acres in size. It heretofore the largest national park in the world, as far as I can remember, is in Greenland. But this park in China is larger than that park. And Greenland is pretty, it's not quite the size of Texas, but I think Texas is looking over its shoulder at that park in Greenland. But Sanjiangyang, that park is even bigger. So, and when I think about that, what that communicates to me is what was communicated to me by a visitor in that visited Yellowstone when I was a gate ranger at the west entrance. And I was explaining to that visitor how far it was to the east entrance over Sylvan Pass, how far it was to the south entrance if they wanted to see the Tetons, how far it was, to go to Cook City, Montana, and go out the Beartooth Highway. And when I explained all these distances to him, these distances in space, not so much in time, but space is to a great degree a reflector of time. And when I was explaining these things, he said to me and looked at me, he says, "You call this place a park, but it's a nation." And I began to think about that it is for people who live in parts of Europe where countries are not as large as the United States. Yellowstone was a nation. Yellowstone was a country. And as I'm speaking to you, you have recognized what I long recognized as well, that when we're inside a large national park, that park is inside us. And we are in the heart of a new world, which is the ancient world, which is the old world, the world that we call this earth. And when you're standing up, as I did in Yellowstone National Park, and you climb or hike up to a mountain peak in Yellowstone, as far as you could see, it was Yellowstone National Park to the horizon in every direction. It was Yellowstone National Park. And I got a sense of that right here in Yosemite when I climbed or hiked to the top of Mount Hoffman, which is pretty close to the geographic center of the park. If you're looking north and south, everything that you can see to a great degree is Yosemite. And that has a transformative effect on one's imagination because you no longer see yourself as being in this little park surrounded by everything else. You see yourself in this smaller place that's part of a larger environment, and that mirror, that lens flips on itself, and suddenly you realize that the world that you're in is a world unto itself, that Yellowstone is a world, that the Grand Canyon is a world, that Zion is a world, Canyonlands, Arches, Wrangell St. Elias, North Cascades, Shenandoah, they're all worlds unto themselves. So, and I think that even confuses visitors when you're at the gate and you show them and talk to them about a passport, and it's a souvenir, but they see it as the real McCoy because it feels like they've passed over at that entrance station, that they've transitioned to a completely different world, a completely different environment. But as we all know, it's the one that's always been embracing them because it's the ancient earth itself. So these were some of the thoughts I had during those lag moments when my words were being translated into Mandarin and then being further translated into Tibetan. And I recognize again that they, as far away as they are, were doing what we're doing. Eventually, when visitors are there, can make that long trek to that park, they'll run into these folks wearing the yellow vests, and they'll have questions for them about who they are, how long have your people been here, what marks your culture as something that's distinct compared to other cultures in China. And when we think of China, we don't normally think of the indigenous people of China, but China has its own indigenous people. And I met many of those folks when I was there as part of the second NPS delegation to mainland China back in 1990. And I remember thinking, they have their own indigenous people like we have here in the Americas, but why don't we hear about them in the United States? And so, and that thought just kept occurring to me over and over again when I was in China. So I felt something similar talking to these unseen, invisible community rangers in the Tibetan plateau who were still hearing our voices as we were, well, not as we were speaking, but in a delayed sense, hearing the words of people that they may never meet who are engaged in a similar occupation, a similar avocation. I mean, because it's not just the work that we do that defines us, it's the work that we do that connects us to something greater. So that's what was going on in my mind. And I remember just thinking, I want to have this conversation be two-way the next time we have it. I want to hear from them. And that means it's going to be even longer of a lag time because then it has to go from, the language has to go from Tibetan to Mandarin and then back into English. And I wonder what was lost in that series of translations, but what was also gained in that series of translations. Because I've always found that the work that we do binds us together and makes us one. And it doesn't matter if you're a biologist who happens to be in Costa Rica or a biologist who happens to be in Suriname. You're both biologists. You both speak the same language. You speak the language of science. And so when someone starts talking about kingdom, phylum, subphylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and everything is in Latin, and you think of Linnaeus, and of course the whole reason why the natural world is in Latin is because it's a dead language. And because it's a dead language, people don't speak it anymore. So it doesn't change through time. But we all know the world changes in a profound way, not just year after year, month after month, century after century, but second by second. Everything is changing, but yet remaining the same and becoming something completely new. And that's fascinating. That's why you can never get tired of looking into nature, because you're looking into the nature of change itself. And that's transformative in terms of vision, but also an internalization of what we see within ourselves that is reflected in the world around us. So all these thoughts are going through my mind. And I realized that the main reason why I want to hear from those rangers, I want to know what it's like. I want to know what it's like to be herding those yaks in the Tibetan Plateau. What is the sunrise like in Sanjianwan National Park? What is the sunset like? What are the soils like? What is the rock, the parent bedrock of that landscape? What sort of plants that are common? What are the plants that are uncommon? What insects, have a facility that speak the language of those plants? And what birds are in the air that literally speak to the insects in a way that the insects may not particularly care for? But I want to see all of those interrelationships and hear about all of those interrelationships, because that's the way that, as a naturalist, I feel grounded when I understand how that natural history that flows through the world, how it flows through me. And to hear that from another ranger on the far side of the world, I mean, that doesn't get old in itself, just saying that. Someone on the far side of the world who speaks the language that we all do. And so that's sort of the thoughts that I had when I was in those silent pauses between communication. So what I realized then is that although we are in different parks and different nations, because we do the same work, that basically we share problems, and the earth essentially is problematic because of the presence of human beings and the Anthropocene, the age of humanity that we're in right now. And maybe the solution to that is to look at everything else that we are ignoring in the world, to remind us of where we came from and what we are still rooted to. Because essentially, you and I, all of us know that the disturbances that we're creating in the natural world stem primarily from the fact that we no longer feel that connection to the world. We no longer feel that rootedness to the world. So that always reminds me of the Greek myth of Antaeus, where Antaeus, the wrestler, could not be defeated as long as his feet touched the earth. And Hercules defeated him by tearing him off the ground. I mean, disconnecting his feet from the planet. And then he held him up high because he was Hercules. And then he strangled him in midair. And when I think about that myth, that common story, it makes me think of the Industrial Revolution and how we did the exact same thing to ourselves, but we didn't need an Antaeus as an antagonist. We did it to ourselves. We tore ourselves away from that rootedness to the earth and are slowly strangling ourselves, in that same process of losing the connection with Mother Earth. So the idea that, again, I was talking to these Tibetan rangers who never lost that connection. We're never culturally, psychologically, physically, emotionally separated from the earth. That is something that we can learn from them that is of greater value than the science. That's the humanities. That's the poetry. That's the rootedness, the cultural connection. That's something that we, to a great degree, except with our own indigenous people here in the Americas, those folks have still remembered what we have forgotten. They still have ceremonies that tie us to the earth. And we need to take part and understand and not just see it and put it in the vein of religious practices, but see it more as a sacrament, a sacred kind of connection that goes back literally to the beginning of time, to the beginning of us as a species. And the only people who are holding on to that rootedness to the earth are these different groups of indigenous people throughout the world, in Amazonia, in China, all throughout the world, all throughout Asia and Africa. They're still holding on to those connections. And I saw that when I was in the Peace Corps. I was a 7th grade English teacher for a brief time in Liberia, West Africa, and I saw these secret societies, the Mande and the Poro, and people didn't talk about them because most of the Liberians had gone Kui, which was a term there for becoming not civilized, but citified. And these people who still lived out in the bush, who still lived out in the wild, still had those connections as well. And we have forgotten that on this technological track that we're on, we can't lose those cultural connections to the earth itself. And if we do, we lose ourselves in the process. And so again, back to China, that's what impressed me about the darkness. That's what protected me or impressed me about the sounds that I was not hearing in their response, because it was a one-way conversation. That's why I'm looking forward to hearing from them, to hear that indigenous perspective that echoes my own indigenous spirit as being African and Cherokee and Seminole and Choctaw and Irish. That's all my bloodlines right there, to hear that reflected. And that's a very powerful thing when that sense of self is mirrored in another person's eyes, and that sense of self is communicated through the tongue of another human being speaking on the far side of the earth to people on the far side of the earth that they may never see in person and may never hear their words in person, except through this medium, this technology that enables us all to have a conversation with each other. So that's what's powerful about all of this. And I realize that they are kindred, they are brothers and sisters of this faith, of this culture of rangering throughout the world. And we need to honor that, and we need to have more of those conversations. So I didn't see this conversation as something separate and unto itself. I saw this conversation as chapter one in a very long novel of communications between myself and others who work for the National Park Service or work for the state parks. Uh, all of us should be a part having these conversations with people who are engaged in similar work, similar problems, and coming up with similar solutions if we share that basic information. So I'm thrilled that I have made this contact with these folks and recognize that we're all part of the same park, the same biosphere, and we need to recognize that, and in all our daily actions, in our love, our passion to protect this planet, which is an extension of the park we happen to be in, that we are speaking this similar language that is not chemistry. This is the language of the heart. And that's what's so important to keep in mind. I remember there was a saying that the indigenous people here in the Americas had when they referred to the colonizers who came in, many of the Europeans who came in, they were saying that they speak with their tongue and the tongue lies, but that they are Indian or Native American, they're indigenous, and they said they speak with the heart, and the heart has no tongue. We need to find that place where the heart and communicating from the heart that has no tongue, so that it is not capable of lying, of prevarication. It only speaks truth. And that's what we need in this world right now. We need that sense of truth. We need that sense of connection. We need that sense of true, honest, clear, concise, poetic conversation and communication in order to protect this world. The biosphere is speaking to us every single moment of every single day. And we need to sharpen our ears in order to hear it, take the fog off our eyes in order to see it, and breathe the fragrance of this planet in order to really get the perfume of everything that has been and everything that is and everything that ever will be. Because the past is present and the present can be the future. And all we have to do is learn to speak that one language of the earth itself and answer the call. Because I think that the earth has been saying to us, what are you doing? What are you thinking? And all we're hearing is blah, 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 blah. But it's as clear as a bell what the earth is saying. And by starting these conversations with rangers all over the world and all the different countries of the world and communicating using the technology that exists right now, this is not a dream. This is not a fantasy. This is right now, at this moment, we have the technology. All we have to do is have the will to go beyond the national boundaries to the boundaries of the biosphere itself and begin to simply talk and listen. And in that process, we can save the world. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Ranger Shelton Johnson, for that wonderful perspective and presentation. We have a lot of questions that have come in via chat over the course of your presentation. But before we get started, Shelton, would you be willing to share a flute song with us before we go into Q&A?
Funny you should ask, Jamie. This is a cedar flute or Plains Indian flute. And traditionally, it would have been played by a man who would play it outside the wickiup or the teepee, whatever name you would, but the indigenous shelter of many different Plains Indians, like the Lakota, Dakota, Sioux, Oglala, Sioux, Cheyenne, the indigenous people of the Great Plains. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
So we
Jamie.
have a few questions that have come in via chat. First off, what inspired you to join the National Park Service?
You know, I was in graduate school majoring in unemployment. It goes by the name of poetry. And before that, I was also majoring in unemployment. It goes by the name of classical music. I was a classical musician in high school. And then in my degrees in English literature, then I was in a master's program in poetry at the University of Michigan. And so if you're a writer and you want to have something interesting to write about, you know, there's different paths that you can take and in terms of becoming known and having your work read. Every writer wants to have their work read. And I thought that, well, very few African Americans have written about the experience of wilderness. And I had not really had an experience of wilderness as an adult, although as a child, I lived in Germany with my father, who was stationed in Bavaria. And my mom, my dad, my brother, and I, there was a family trip to Berchtesgaden, which is now a sister park to Yosemite. And at that time, I didn't know anything about national parks. I didn't know anything about conservation. All I knew was that I was standing eventually on a precipice with a railing between me and eternity. You know, there was just this view straight down, down, down to clouds 1,000 feet below my feet. And I could see the shadow of those clouds 1,000 or so feet below the clouds themselves. And I looked up and there were these banners of snow unfurling from these mountain peaks. And I was right there, caught between earth and sky. And it was one of those moments that are transfigurative, and it changed me. And I didn't know it at the time, but it was like John Muir talks about your molecules being rearranged, or something along those lines. And that was happening to me, but it was a pre-verbal, pre-language experience. It was beyond language. It was just visceral. And I never forgot that moment. And it's good that I did not, because when my family eventually returned to Detroit, Detroit looks nothing like Yellowstone. It looks nothing like Berchtesgaden. And but I could close my eyes and I'd have all these memories of being suspended between heaven and earth in Berchtesgaden before it actually became a national park. It was a preserved area. But I was there in 1963. I was 5 years old. And that was the seed that was planted. And that seed eventually sprouted, and I just became a park ranger. I just naturally felt inclined to being in nature and being in wilderness.
Thank you. This leads us to our next question. Have you found a background in poetry, literature, and theater has been beneficial training as an interpreter?
Yeah, I found it not only to be beneficial, I found it to be core to who I am, because the thing to keep in mind is that to a great degree, science is the language of creation. It's the language of the universe itself, physics, but not just physics, but when you look at geology, you look at soil science, you look at botany, you look at entomology, the study of insects, you look at the avian sciences, mammalogy, biology, wildlife biology, atmospheric sciences. We've broken up the planet. It was doing pretty well all together, all by itself, all connected, and we've broken it up into all of these different sciences. But the Earth doesn't function in it's a systemic functioning of a planet, of a biosphere, and yet we don't look at it that way. We look at it through the lens of all these different glasses that you put on, and look at your part of the world. And that's what I admire about indigenous people. They don't break it up. It's not a fragmentary view. It's a holistic view. And it would be great if those two paths can converge in the same way that our eyes have that same convergence that gives us depth of field. That's why we have two eyes instead of one eye, because of that depth of field. And that's what we're lacking right now. We're lacking depth of field in terms of how we look at nature and how we look at the world around us. And that's one thing I think is important to communicate to park visitors before we get into the sciences, before we get into natural history, to talk about just how who we are as a species limits our perception of the world that embraces us all.
Thank you, Shelton. I saw you
Thank
at the
you.
8th World Ranger Congress. What lessons did you take away from that experience in 2016?
The main lesson I took away from that experience of being the World Ranger Congress is that to me, what it began to feel like, it started out with all these people speaking all the different languages. I mean, I heard Italian, I heard German, I heard Japanese, you heard these different African languages. And I remember there was the separateness of all that. All these people together, it was like it was like the UN. Then after a bit, it became closer. It became much more intimate in the sense of the work that we do, which is what I just was speaking to. And I realized that essentially, in retrospect, which literally means to look back, so that when I look back at that experience, I see it as a family reunion, and it was just the work that we do every day as professionals engaged in these earth sciences, is engaged in telling stories. And those stories are all about ourselves and all about each other and all about our relatives. And everything is a relative. Everyone is a relation, and every living thing is a relation. And so the World Ranger Congress that I had the privilege of being the opening keynote speaker, which I still can't believe happened, but it did. That was a way of speaking to family members. It's just like when a grandmother, a grandfather, an elder stands up and speaks to the assembled family. I felt that I had that privilege, that honor to speak to my cousins and my brothers and my sisters. And maybe my mom and dad were out there too. And it felt that way. It felt kindred. It felt powerful. It felt there was a level of intimacy of spirit, mind, and the blood itself of the green and gray and all the other shades of what it means to be a park ranger, a protector of the earth.
Ranger Johnson, you've spent a lot of time researching and sharing the stories of the Buffalo Soldiers. What is it that inspired you to share this lost history?
What inspired me to share that lost history was that, there I was in Yellowstone and I perceived myself to be alone. I perceived myself as being different from everyone around me because I was the only African American park ranger when I worked in Yellowstone. And so when I learned about the Buffalo Soldier history here in Yosemite from, through Althea Roberson and before her Kenneth Noel, who I never met, but they were the torchbearers before myself. I realized that, why am I complaining? What do I have to complain about in terms of difficulty or challenges? Challenges make us stronger. That's what evolution is all about. Earth presents a challenge, you rise to it or you fail. But in the rising, you become stronger. And I realized that the Buffalo Soldier history reminded me that my ancestors dealt with and connected to an earth that was much more hostile to their presence than this world has been to my presence. So it actually, ironically, made me feel better about my experiences and made me feel stronger, and that I stood on the shoulders of literal giants that were in the blood, my own ancestry. And they would look at me and say, "You think you're having a hard day? Sit down. I'll talk to you about a hard day," and what it was like in 1903, 1904, 1899, the years that African American soldiers were protecting Yosemite and Sequoia and telling Euro Americans the regulations of the park and what they were allowed to do and what they were disallowed to do. And that conversation at the same time in the Deep South would have been suicidal because of the racial animus that existed in the United States around the turn of the last century. So what do I feel when I tell that story? I feel this sense of empowerment. I feel this sense of connection to ancestral connection to the earth. And I feel this sense of pride, that people who look like me played a role in the preservation of the earth itself and the creation of the national park idea. And it gave that idea roots in Yellowstone and Sequoia and Yosemite. So it's a sense of pride, but it's not being proud in the sense of being better than anyone else. It's just a sense of hey, that's part of who I am. So it felt really empowering in that sense and humbling.
Shelton, what's the most exciting project that you've participated in over your long career?
This one right now, because it's in the present moment. I mean, the past is great. I mean, I've had some wonderful moments in my career. I mean, when Oprah and Gail, I wrote to Oprah and Gail because of this issue of, excuse me, I'm getting emotional. I wanted to get this history of Buffalo soldiers within the African American community, which I still haven't succeeded at. But you don't measure success by literally if you succeed or fail, because that sets you up for one or the other. You measure it, did you push that weight on that continuum towards eventual success? And I feel that I have. And by reaching out to Oprah and having her willingness to amplify the message of inclusivity as opposed to exclusivity, connection as opposed to disconnection, and love as opposed to hate. That was a great connection. So she came to the fore, and she camped with Gail King, and it was a very powerful moment to see her in front of me. It almost resulted in me being in a state of shock and unconsciousness, and maybe flatlining because I was really in shock. But I didn't show that I was in shock, which apparently disturbed her people, who were wanting me to evince a level of excitement that I apparently failed to do. But as Rangers, we are taught to treat everyone the same, with an equal measure of respect and decorum. And I maintain that respect and decorum, but they took it as he acts like he sees us all the time. And I can say to you, I do not see Oprah and Gail all the time, but it was an incredible experience working with Oprah and Gail and showing them the park, showing them their own inheritance as American citizens, that America's best idea belonged to them as much as it belongs to anyone else. And that was very powerful. It still is. 10 years later, that was 10 years ago. Keep waiting for Oprah to call. It hasn't happened yet, but hope springs eternal. So.
And we've got one last question today. Shelton, there's a lot of Rangers that have joined us for Ranger Rendezvous 43 that are starting their career, that are in the first, 1 to 5 years of their career, either as seasonals or as first-time permanent employees of the National Park Service. We actually have a few Rangers from outside the National Park Service, from other organizations, who joined us. What advice do you have for any Rangers that are starting their career?
The main advice I have is, do not underestimate the power of being new. That we have a culture that promotes being an old timer, being wise. Wisdom is always greater than intelligence. We have a lot of intelligent people out there, but we don't have very many wise people out there. And if the chips fall where they may, but if they fall in the wrong direction, and you have to align yourself with someone who's either extremely intelligent or extremely wise, I'd maybe have both of them. But if you have to angle to one or the other, I would go with someone who is wise, because wisdom comes about through pain, through suffering, through understanding, and intelligence, not so much. I would say that just honor your new vision that you have when you first wear the gray and green, or you first become a conservation biologist, or whatever it might be. When you're in a park, you're seeing it anew. You're seeing it as with fresh eyes, and don't underestimate that. Write down your impressions. Write down what you feel about what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're touching, and how it has touched you. Write those thoughts down, because eventually it is part of human nature to stop seeing what is there right in front of us, because it's familiar. It's from predator-prey relationships. The reason why the new steps out is because there could be a predator lurking there. The deer are looking for a discontinuity, something that doesn't quite blend in, because predators try to blend in. And so to see the world fresh means to see it anew every single day. And you have to work at that, because the mind has a way of normalizing everything that you see. Work against the grain of that, so that every sunrise is the first time you've ever seen the sun rise up. Every moonrise is the first time you've ever seen the moon come up and fill the sky with that light. Every time you see a bee, what kind of bee is it? It's the first time you've ever seen a bee. Hold on to that childlike wonder, that childlike curiosity about the natural world, and you'll always be better than you imagined that you could be as a naturalist, and also better than you could possibly be as a historian, or any of those other aspects of being a ranger, because we just have this part of human nature to become accustomed to the ordinary, and to begin to fail to see, step by step, we stop seeing the extraordinary. And Yosemite Valley is an extraordinary environment. And when I first arrived in the valley, I could always tell the visitors from the employees, because the visitors were just like this. And the employees were like this because they've seen it. And because you think you've seen it, you think there's nothing else there to see. You've heard it. So because you've heard it, you think there's nothing else there to hear. But you're forgetting about the migrants, the birds who come from Costa Rica or Central America, who are announcing their presence. I'm back. I'm back. Listen to me. You know, that's important to always, a good naturalist is always someone who sees each day as a new day, and you never know what surprise is around the bend of the trail. And that's the great way to navigate life itself, is to always be in this posture of expectation and excitement.
Well, thank you very much, Shelton, for all of those wonderful thoughts. It's been such a joy and privilege to have you with us today. And thank you for taking time to join us for Ranger Rendezvous 43. Do you have any closing thoughts today?
My closing thought would be, it's been an honor, Jamie. It's been an honor, Jamie, as it always is, to work with you. It's been an honor to talk to my fellow and sister Rangers. All we have to remember is hold on to each other, hold on to our ideals, hold on to our thoughts that direct those ideals and interact with them. But really, more than anything else, is just do the right thing in all that we do. If we just focus on doing what is right and keeping to that moral center, not just the moral center of ourselves as human beings, but the earth itself has a moral center as well. But you know what? It can stray from it. If a species decides to go in the wrong direction, it says, okay, I can live without you. And so the earth, we need the earth more than the earth needs us. And we just have to remember that we should be shepherding, we should be taking care of the planet, because it's the only one that we have. And as long as we have those thoughts in mind, it'll all be good.
I want to thank everyone for tuning in today and joining this really special presentation and conversation with Ranger Shelton Johnson. And Shelton, would you be willing to share a final song with us today?
You mean the flute?
Yes, please.
I'd be happy to.